Hello, everyone, and welcome. Really welcome. I was thinking today that we should have a quick chat about variables and the life cycle of variables. Starting presentation. Okay, so the service point variables that you declare when you design your service must be linked to form field to be populated from one of those forms. So typically, in this scenario, you have a variable called first name. Someone posts it, and you link that to a first name form field. And the user, when placing the order, puts Bengt as a value on first name. Then, when the user posts the form, it goes into the workflow. And for instance, you might have a built-in activity, in this case an assign activity, that modifies the value. So in this case, first name gets changed to Bengt within parentheses modified, like illustrated here. We might also have a PowerShell provider, a provider activity we call it. And as long as you modify it and return it as an hash, for instance, like I've done here, we can do changes to the variable here as well. So first name gets concatenated with the first name that was sent into the provider, and we just add again to the end. So the value will now be Bengt within parentheses modified again. And later in our workflow, we may have a task activity with a task form. And the task form may be the same form or a specific form that you design for this task. Typically, maybe you take a copy of the order form and you present the first name as a read-only field for the one who is going to approve the order. But in this case, we didn't create a custom task form. We just took the same form. So the first name field is not read-only, which caused the manager to change the first name from Bengt to Gregory. And after our approval, we may have a send email activity like we have in this case. And we can use our variable in our email template. So in this case, we write hello, curly bracket, first name, end curly bracket, exclamation mark. And the result will be hello, Gregory. Very personal. A fail will be hello, first name. So when you highlight the variable, when you use the variable in email templates, the key is to use curly brackets. And then we might continue with the rest of our workflow, and eventually we come to a stop of the workflow. And for this to work, the variable must be bound to all the form fields that it's used in. So if it's connected to, or it's bound to a field in the order field, and the user puts something in there, you would have it on the workflow, and you can work with it later in email templates or whatever. The same goes for task forms. So if you post it from an order form, do some stuff with it in the workflow, then you post it back to a task form to present to an approver. It needs to be bound to be presented in the form. And it can also be manipulated in the task form by user interaction or by JavaScript or whatever. And when you work with PowerShell activities, you might have a function like I have here called getMyStuff with an ID parameter and a reply parameter. And in this case, we have the ID parameter bound to our first name variable. So in code, we have ID here, and then we just get a random number, and we return a hash table with the first name property, and that name needs to match the variable name in Zervicepoint. And then we just take the ID, that's the first name, that's the variable value that we got from the workflow, and we put the random number on the end. And it's important to know when you're debugging this, you might post a form and then you get some kind of error in your workflow and you want to see what kind of variable values you had. If you go into the order manager, you only get the initial values of the variables, meaning that you only get the variable values that was the way they were when the form was posted. The reason for that is because when you order a form, we store it in our Zervicepoint database, and then we create a workflow which creates entries in the workflow manager database, which is encrypted, and all the manipulations done later in the workflow will live in the workflow manager database. If you want to debug your variable values, put state activities close to where you have your problem and write out the variable values as a status. Or if you have a PowerShell provider, you can simply outport out. Okay, I'm going to show you. If, for instance, in this case, you wonder what ID is in this case, I would just simply do like this. So when the workflow hits this activity, it would take what's in the ID variable and throw it to an XML file in my temp folder. And after I place this workflow, I can see in my temp folder that this file gets created. And if I want to debug my activity, I can just do like this. And then I get whatever value I got from running this provider into my ID variable in PowerShell, and I can continue debugging my workflow. And it's important to know that the presentation name of a variable in a form can be different from the actual value. Here illustrated with a static dropdown. So if the variable value, if this is a task form where we present a selected language, and the value of the selected language variable is sv-se, and if we have this dropdown in a task form and we bind that variable to this dropdown, the user will see Swedish instead of this. And that applies to everything you have in forms, as long as you have a display name and the value pair. So that's drop downs basically, and multi-select checkboxes, I believe. Then we have different types of variables. We have string variables, which I'm not going to explain, but I can say it's a text string basically. It can have a default value in Zervicepoint. You can also choose to hide the value, and that can be used to mask part of the value or the whole value itself. And the mask will be applied once the order is placed, which will, so even if you're an administrator and you go into the order manager, you will see the masked value, and it will be masked on the server side, so you can't just hit F12 and get the real value. And same goes for the API, and same goes for, everything. So you can actually access the real value if you have the adequate accesses to the database. But if you have adequate database rights, you may do whatever you want, basically. Okay, Booleans is true or false, and we have, typically we use them, an example is you need to have a Boolean variable if you want to get the approval result from an approval activity. So it will indicate true if the approval was approved, and false if the approval was rejected. A decimal is a number, and it's typically used when you want to have some dynamic time for when an approval is supposed to time out. And you bind the approval timeout seconds, for instance. So you can define, or you can have a workflow that calculates the timeouts in seconds, depending on some kind of parameter. Datetime is used for the date form field, and we have the file variable type as well. It's actually represented by a GUID, so it's a long number, and but it's its own type, and you must have, excuse me, you must have a file variable type if you're going to use attachments in your email templates or your send email activities. And I have mentioned this in different videos in the past, so you can go ahead and go back and watch them. And I think the one related to cart files. And lastly, you have the translation variable, and that's mainly used to have status strings to return to the user in their language. And I recommend you watch the previous video I did the last time, because that handles and talks about the translation variables extensively. And that's it. If you have any questions about variables, feel free to reach out in the community or write a comment below. And talk to you next week.